welcome everybody. We're excited tonight. We have the Penguin Lady with us. Her real name is Diane DiNapoli, but we know her as the Penguin Lady. And she's going to tell you all about her background and what she does and about those cute little penguins and how they need our help. Thanks,
Okay.
Diane.
Thanks, Terry. Well, welcome everybody. How are you doing tonight?
Good.
Good? Thank you for coming out tonight. I'll just give you a little brief background about who I am. My name is Diane DiNapoli, known as the Penguin Lady. I worked at Boston's New England Aquarium for 9 years. I was a senior penguin aquarist there, so I took care of the penguins. And I was there until 2004, and then I left and started my company, which is called the Penguin Lady. And now I travel locally and internationally. I teach adults and children of all ages about penguin biology, behavior, and conservation. My mission is to raise awareness and funding to protect penguins because 15 now of the 18 penguin species are listed as threatened or endangered. And so I donate 20% of the proceeds from my book and from every appearance to penguin rescue groups. And so I love what I do. I'm passionate about what I do. And so today I wanted to tell you about the most extraordinary experience of my life. And I am just going to ask, could we turn off this bank of lights again?
I just turned it up.
Okay, thank you. Just so people can see this better. Thanks. So I was working at the New England Aquarium. Actually, I'm going to go back just a little bit because sometimes what I do when I do a presentation, a lot of times I'm hired to come in and give the story of the treasure oil spill rescue. So I just have a long slideshow and talk for 45 minutes or an hour and just tell that story. But tonight is billed as an author event, and so normally for an author event, sometimes I don't even show pictures and I just talk about the book process and writing the book and a little bit about the story and maybe read a few selections. Tonight I wanted to mix it up a little bit, do something a little bit different. So I'm going to do a little bit of both. I want to tell you a little bit about what brought me to write this book, a little tiny bit, just briefly about my background and why I'm so passionate about this subject. And then I am going to show you some slides from this oil spill rescue and read a few selections from the book. And there's Sally, who I haven't seen in a long time. Hi, Sally. This is the Great Penguin Rescue. So when I was a kid, every once in a while, every so often, my mother would say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I have no idea. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow, let alone 10, 20 years from now. But I had all these sort of fantasies and dreams. And one of the things I was always the most passionate about was animals and the ocean. I grew up near the ocean. I grew up in Marblehead, Mass. And so my parents were sailors and skiers. And so we were always out on the water. And I loved being in the ocean, loved animals. And the thing I really wanted to be, aside from a geeky little kid, that wasn't my goal. Was to be a dolphin trainer. So you might notice my lunchbox, which was my prized possession, had Flipper the dolphin on it. And Flipper was my idol. And most of you probably know who Flipper was. For those who don't, Flipper was a dolphin who would save humans from all the stupid things that they did. And so she was a very smart dolphin who could communicate with these two young boys that lived in Florida, and I wanted to grow up and work with Flipper. And so that was always this dream that I had in the back of my head, but no one could tell me how to do that. The teachers in school, they couldn't guide me in any direction. And besides that, it just seemed like a total fantasy job. Like, real people don't do that. You see that on TV or in the movies, but who is a dolphin trainer? I didn't know anybody who was a dolphin trainer. The other thing I dreamed about was writing a book. I loved reading, I loved writing, and I understand we have a very young author in the front row. I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards. How old are you? 8, and you've written a book already?
Yeah.
That's pretty exciting. That's pretty amazing. That's impressive. So, but again, that to me seemed like this fantasy that someday I'll write a book, but I had no idea what I'd ever write a book about until this experience that I had in South Africa. So I kind of floated around for many, many years. Sort of life took this circuitous route, and I did a lot of different things and tested out a lot of different things while my parents kept saying, "Aren't you going back to college yet?" So it took about 11 years. I was a ski bum in Colorado, which was a ton of fun. I also was an assistant dog trainer at a place called Needs out in West Boylston, Mass. That trained service dogs, mostly for people either who were in wheelchairs or were deaf. And that was very rewarding. It was a volunteer position. I was a waitress for many, many years, and also during the time that I was a waitress, I was a silversmith. And what I found is really interesting connection that I didn't realize once I started working at the aquarium, how many of us that were artists are also scientists. There seems to be some connection in the brain between art and science. And so I was a jeweler for 8 years, and I sold my work up and down the eastern seaboard at galleries and shops and craft shows. And towards the end of my 8 years of being a silversmith, I created a line of endangered species jewelry. Because I always wanted to do something to save endangered species. From the time I was a little kid, as soon as I learned about endangered species, I was traumatized by this. You know, like animals disappear forever, how can that be? And I want to do something about that, but what could one person possibly do to make a difference? And besides the fact I'm a kid, so what could I do? So I kind of felt pretty powerless about that. But when I started doing this line of jewelry, I said, well, I'm going to donate 20% of the proceeds from this jewelry to different environmental groups. And so that felt good, you know, I'm like, okay, I'm doing a little bit. I'm doing something to give back. But after a while, it didn't feel like enough. I wanted to be doing something more. I wanted to be doing something more tangible. And so when I was 30, for my 30th birthday, my parents gave me the amazing gift of an Earthwatch expedition. Now, you guys familiar with Earthwatch? Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple of you are. If you're not, Earthwatch, it used to be based in Watertown. Now they're in Alston. And they're actually international. And what they are is an organization, it's a nonprofit, and you go on a volunteer vacation. So you pay to go on this vacation, and during this vacation you're working in the field with some researcher. And it could be anthropology, it could be biology, archaeology, all different topics, usually science topics for the most part. And you volunteer your time and your money. Your money helps to fund the doctor's project. And so I went to Hawaii. And I spent a month at a dolphin research center in Hawaii. And I fell in love. And I did not want to leave. And I said, I need to come back as an intern. They had this intern program there where you could go for 4 to 5 months and work full-time as an intern and become a dolphin trainer. I said, I need to do that. So I went home and I applied for this internship. And I was all raring to go, and I was rejected. Oh, crap. So what do I need to do to get this internship? And I said, well, you need to go back, because I had gone to college for 2 years, and I had a liberal arts, associate's degree in liberal arts, which is kind of like an associate's degree in nothing. And so they said, well, you need to have a different educational background. So I went back to college to get a bachelor of science degree in veterinary science and become a veterinary nurse. And after 2 years, I applied again, and I got the internship. And so I spent 4 months in Hawaii at the Dolphin Research Center and became a dolphin trainer. And it was awesome. It was so amazing. It was so cool working with these animals. And it was a dream come true. And then my next year, my senior year in college, I had an internship because we had to do internships at this program. And the senior year was all internships. I spent 5 months at the New England Aquarium in Boston. And 4 of those 5 months were in the penguin department. And I was captivated by the penguins. Don't tell the penguins, but dolphins are still kind of my first love. Well-guarded secret. But the penguins were pretty cool. And they really sort of captured my heart. And I knew when I graduated, I wanted to stay in the Boston area. You know, my family was here, and I said, you know, I want to stay in this area. And so I decided to apply for a position in the penguin department. And so after, let me see, it took 1.5 years for a position to open up, but I was hired. And so this picture was taken just before this oil spill took place. So I'd been at the aquarium at this point for 3 years. I was now a penguin aquarist. And the woman on my right is Mandy, who is a dear friend and colleague. And this picture was taken, it was our breeding season. This was the summer of 2000. It was the middle of our breeding season, and what we're doing is weighing penguin. This is roast beef, and his brother Plum Pudding is in the cave behind there. And these might sound like, you know, funny names to you for penguins, but actually all the penguins at the New England Aquarium are given educational names to teach you something about the penguins and where they're from. And roast beef and Plum Pudding are 2 islands off the coast of South Africa and Namibia where African penguins breed. So that's how they get their names. So now around the time this picture was taken, this ship called the Treasure, this was June 23rd, 2000, sank off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. And when it sank, it spilled 1,300 tons of its fuel oil. Now, compared to the BP oil spill, where millions and millions and millions of gallons gushed into the Gulf of Mexico, this is like a thimbleful. However, because of the location of where the ship went down and this oil spill took place, and because of the species affected, penguins are flightless birds, so they can't fly away to get away from the oil spill, it had devastating impact. And so nearly half of the entire world population of African penguins was at risk from this oil spill. So at the time, the world population was about 165,000 penguins, and about almost half of those were potentially going to be affected. Now, the Treasure sank between Robben Island here to the south and Dasson Island here to the north in Table Bay of Cape Town, and that was June 23rd of 2000. Now, ironically, 6 years and 3 days earlier, another ship managed by the same shipping company, named the Apollo C, sank on June 20th, 1994. And at that time, that was the largest penguin rescue that had ever taken place. There were 10,000 penguins, half of which unfortunately did not survive. And I'll talk about why that was in just a moment. So when the Treasure sank, before long, there were 20,000 penguins that were oiled. Now, the reason in the Apollo C oil spill those penguins did not survive was due to the unwitting use of unventilated transport boxes and trucks. So essentially they went to sleep. It was, a quick, painless way to go, but that is what happened. So in the 6 intervening years between these 2 oil spills, they had designed and built tens of thousands of these well-ventilated transport boxes. And as a result, we only lost, out of 40,000 penguins that were moved in these boxes during the Treasure oil spill, only 150 or so penguins were lost during the transport process, which is incredible, just miraculous success rate for that part of it. So it was in South Africa the height of the breeding season when this oil spill took place, and so a lot of penguin parents were raising chicks. So really the location and the timing couldn't have been worse. So there was a massive immediate effort that took place to rescue these parents and the chicks. And so these were some of these 20,000 adult penguins that were covered with oil. Now, what happened was the local rescue center is called Sandcob. They've been around now for 40 years. At this point, they have rescued and rehabilitated nearly 100,000 penguins, most of which were oiled. They are designed to hold about 2,000 penguins. Within 3 days of the Treasure oil spill, they were bursting at the seams with 5,000 penguins. And they said, what are we going to do? And they realized we need a much larger facility. And so what they did was they procured this train. This was a warehouse that was used to repair coal transport trains. They got this warehouse, they procured it. It had nothing in it. It had some electricity, it had a little bit of running water, but basically in 3 days' time, from the ground up, they built a fully functioning animal hospital, which was incredible. And I just want to read you a little bit here about this, because when we arrived here, this was what we first saw. The place was just a beehive of activity, thousands of volunteers rushing in and out of this building, and it was quite an impactful moment. So I just want to read you a little bit about that setting up of the rescue center. It's hard to imagine just how much space 19,000 penguins take up. As the oiled penguins were rescued from the islands, they were brought directly to Sandcob, but before long, the small rehabilitation center was packed far beyond its intended capacity. They were already housing close to 5,000 penguins at a center designed to hold a maximum of 2,000. Estelle, who was the center manager, and the others knew they might soon have to provide refuge for another 10,000 oiled penguins, and quite possibly more. But there was no place to house them. The situation was critical. The pressure was on to find a much larger building to convert into a temporary rescue center, but locating and preparing an appropriate building was only part of the challenge. Estelle and her newly assembled rescue team would also need a small army of volunteers to staff the second facility and provide specialized care for the impending onslaught of oiled penguins. A massive warehouse normally used to repair coal transport trains was secured near Cape Town's waterfront to become the temporary rehabilitation center for the penguins. Its original designation was simply Shed Number 12. But once it was renovated, this 236,000 square foot building, over 5 acres in size, became known as the Salt River Penguin Crisis Center. As the rescue operation progressed, the plan was to gradually move the penguins that had been washed to a sprawling space adjacent to the warehouse where they would complete their rehabilitation. This outdoor area, spread over 6 acres, would eventually have several large swimming pools and more than a dozen enormous holding pens with 1,000 to 1,500 penguins in each one. Marriott Hopley, who most of us working the rescue viewed as the patron saint of penguins, was a driving force behind the creation of the Salt River Penguin Crisis Center. This superhuman dynamo, who was a semi-retired major with the South African Air Force at the time of the Treasure oil spill, managed to procure the resources and manpower to get the Salt River facility built and ready for 16,000 penguins in just 3 days' time. It was not the first time she had worked such a miracle. During the Apollo C oil spill 6 years earlier, when she was just 26 years old, Marriott supervised the creation of a temporary rehabilitation center to accommodate the 10,000 oiled penguins that were rescued. With that experience under her belt, Marriott already knew exactly whom to contact and how to proceed the moment she received the call to help. A no-nonsense woman with remarkable stamina, strong leadership skills, and outstanding organizational expertise, she worked tirelessly to ensure the rescue center was functional as quickly as possible. I'm going to stop at that point and continue to our next slide. So, what was really astonishing walking into this rescue center, aside from seeing 16,000 oiled penguins in these pools, was seeing how many volunteers had come to help save these penguins. And this was truly the most moving part of this entire rescue operation. All of us that were there in official capacity were just blown away by these people that came from all over the world. And none of these people had any experience doing this. You know, they didn't have to be there, yet they were. You know, there were only, over the course of the 3 months that this rescue took, about 110 of us that came in staggered shifts who were actual penguin experts or wildlife rehabbers. There were another 12,500 completely inexperienced volunteers who came to do this absolutely grueling work. I mean, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I can't even explain the bone-numbing exhaustion, the stress, the anxiety. It was just so intense. And it was so amazing to see all of these volunteers who came. And there were people I would meet in the room that we were managing. I met people from every country, and a lot of them were actually, they'd come to South Africa for vacation. And when the oil spill happened and they heard that we needed help down at the rescue center, they abandoned their vacation plans and they showed up every single day and, you know, got onto these yellow oil skins, got all geared up and climbed into a pool and scrubbed penguin poo or fed penguins or did whatever was needed to help. So it was really this extraordinary outpouring of compassion from people all over the globe. And there was a short passage I wanted to read about this as well. And also, I want to say, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, and I usually do, is if anybody has questions along the way, please feel free to ask. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end to ask any questions that you might have as they come up, okay? Because of its unprecedented size, this was, by the way, the largest animal rescue, and still stands as such, that has ever taken place. Because of its unprecedented size, the oil spill and ensuing rescue effort had attracted international media attention. A week into our stay, a film crew went from room to room, separately interviewing each member of our immediate team. During my interview, when asked what I thought about all of the volunteers, I started to answer. It's going to happen again. Saying how amazing they were and how grateful we all were to them. but quickly got so choked up I could no longer speak. Tears sprung to my eyes and time stretched as I silently fought to regain my composure. But before I could do so, the interviewer started weeping, as did the cameraman and sound man, and filming had to be halted while we all pulled ourselves together. Bringing these grown men to their knees. Breaking the unspoken professional code of journalism, the young woman conducting the interview asked if I could use a hug, which I gratefully accepted. News crews and film crews are trained to be objective and reserved, but the scene in that warehouse was devastating, even to them. Like us, though, they could sense the human miracle that was occurring there. Thousands of people from Cape Town and from all around the globe had come together and were working beyond the point of exhaustion in horrendous conditions to save the oil penguins. I apologized to the film crew for crying, but they waved off my apology, saying that the same thing had happened with every other member of our team, male and female alike, and that they were becoming accustomed to the emotional response this question evoked each time it was asked. I am not someone who cries readily, yet even to this day, when talking about the oil spill, I'm sometimes caught off guard when, without warning, my voice catches in my throat and tears blur my vision as I recall the incredible volunteers we worked with each day. And see, it does still sometimes happen. So, the day after we arrived, we were put in charge of this room. And this is you're seeing about 3/4 of our room. And this room had more than 4,000 oiled penguins in it. There were about 125 penguins in each of these pools. Now at this stage, when this photo was taken, I did not have a second to take any photos during this rescue effort. In fact, when we got back to the aquarium, our boss said, "What do you mean you didn't get pictures? Why didn't you get pictures of yourselves there?" We're like, "Dan, we were a little busy." And so we ran on the way to the airport. We stopped quickly at the center to say goodbye to everybody and run through the building and take some quick photos. So that's when this photo was taken. And at this point, we're 3 weeks into the rescue, so a lot of the penguins have already been washed and are outside. So a lot of these pools are empty at this point. But, they said, we got there. The first day, we went from pool to pool, force feeding penguins, and they said that night we had our debriefing meeting at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Those of us that had come as experts, and they said, "Okay, here's your assignment." They said, "Heather and Diane, you're in charge of room 2. That has 4,000 oiled penguins in it. Go do it." that was it. There were no other instructions. So we basically had to take our knowledge that we had from taking care of 60 penguins and 3 volunteers a day at the New England Aquarium and extrapolate to 4,000 oiled penguins and about 250 volunteers a day. So I can honestly tell you, that was the most terrifying moment of my entire life, because I thought there is no way I can do this. Like, this is impossible. No one has ever done this before on this scale. So we all just were overwhelmed, completely overwhelmed. Yes?
What did you wash them with?
Oh, I will get to that in a minute, but yes, thank you for asking. I will talk about that in just another couple slides.
Did you see 125 penguins
in each
one?
Yes. They were basically shoulder to shoulder. And they're not used to being that crowded. They're very territorial birds, and they do live in crowded colonies, but they usually have a few feet between each of their nests. So, they weren't so happy about being in these crowded conditions. But basically, they were sort of in shock. They weren't really reacting much. They just kind of, were standing there. I think, they're covered with oil, they're in an unnatural situation, so it was very stressful for the penguins as well as for the people. So, what was really incredible and what kept us going and what gave us hope every day were all of these remarkable volunteers. These were 3 of our sort of star volunteers who became like supervisors by proxy. This is Erwin, Isabella, and Dennis inside the pool here, and they were there every single day, no matter what. The volunteers, by the way, they only had to work a 5-hour shift, so they had 3 5-hour shifts throughout the day and night. Of course, we were there 18, 20 hours a day, but they only had to do a 5-hour shift. These people, well, Isabella and and Dennis, all day, all night, every day without a break. We had to say, "You have to go home, you have to take a break." They say, "No, we can't. And you really felt this sense of urgency. We didn't stop to eat, we didn't stop to drink, we didn't stop to go to the bathroom. I lost 12 pounds in 18 days. I don't recommend it as a diet plan, but it was quite effective. And Irwin, what you can't tell is he actually has his business suit on underneath his oilskins. He would come every day at 5 o'clock, he'd leave work, he'd have his briefcase under his arm, put on the oilskins, put his briefcase down outside of the pen, climb in and start force feeding penguins. And it was like his personal mission to feed every penguin that he possibly could. He'd move to the next pool, take his briefcase with him, and he smiled all the time. I don't know why. He was always smiling. He just would bring, this light and this joy to our day. And you might see when you're force feeding a penguin, this is not easy to do. First, you have to catch a penguin, and there, it's a circular pool, so there's no corners. So you're like doing this little Keystone Cops thing inside the pool to catch one. And then you finally catch one, and you sit down on this little stool, and you squeeze its body between your legs, you pry its beak open with 2 hands, you hold it open with 1 hand, reach down into the bucket next to you and grab a slippery sardine. If you ever try to hang on to a fish, you know how hard that is to do. And then try and shove that sardine down the penguin's throat. Meanwhile, the penguin's going, no, 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 and it's trying to spit out the sardine. So this takes a lot of time and effort, and it would take 3 or 4 people 2 to 2.5 hours generally to feed the penguins in one pool, sometimes 3 hours. So this is a very long, laborious process. So during the Apollo C spill 6 years old, yes?
Why did you have to force feed them?
Exactly. They're wild animals. They, number one, don't recognize this dead, frozen, thawed fish as food. And, what are these big monsters trying to grab me and feed me? So they're not just going to waddle over to you like they do at the aquarium and open up their beak and say, okay, put in a fish. However, this is the amazing thing. Penguins are extremely smart, adaptable birds. Now, bear in mind, these are wild animals, okay? During the Apollo C 6 years earlier, Mariette, this woman who I mentioned before, she had come up with this idea. Let's see if we can train these penguins to free feed, to walk over and voluntarily open up their beak. And so during the Apollo C spill 6 years earlier, they had designed these feeding boxes. And they would herd in like 3 penguins at a time and then press the fish against their beak until they opened up their beak and took the fish. And once they, on their own, opened up their beak and took the fish, and as many as they wanted, they'd let them out the other side. It had like little guillotine doors on either side. They'd let them out the other side. The amazing thing, that was within just a few days to a week, a lot of these penguins were free feeding. And not only were they free feeding, they didn't have to use the boxes anymore. They just run up to the side of the pool and they saw a human coming by with a fish bucket and open up their beak, the way they do at the aquarium. These are wild animals. I honestly can't think of any other wild animal that would do that, that would adapt so quickly and willingly to just walk up to a human and open up its beak to be fed. So they're amazingly smart birds, but the thing that was so cool that we noted, because we used this technique at the treasure oil spill, and what we noticed was that the first birds to make that transition to free feeding were the ones that had a metal band on their wing from the Apollo C oil spill 6 years earlier. They remembered. They remembered 6 years later. And then the other birds, the new ones who hadn't gone through this, they learned by observation. They would watch these other birds, and I guess they figured, well, they're not, getting killed or something, so we can do this maybe. So it was a remarkable thing to see these birds do this, make this transition.
Before you got them to free feed, how did you keep track of which ones had been force fed and which ones?
Good question. I'm going to go back to this slide for a minute. Do you see this woman here? She's a runner getting the food, but also there's another person standing here, and he's probably his job. We would have people between the pools, and so when this person, say Dennis, finishes feeding this bird, what he does is hand this bird to this person, and that person then puts it into an empty pool behind.
Okay.
So you had like this room that has you had some empty pools all the time, because you take this one and put them all in here, this one and put them all in here, and then you had a tag that you had to try to remember to move to this pen. So it was like this football, scenario. You had a board with all the pools and who's going where and who went what and which ones cleaned and which ones swum and which ones fed. So it was this very sort of complicated choreography that you did every single day to figure out who's fed, who's cleaned, who's swum. So and then this next story, actually what would happen is that one of our jobs was to safely train these people how to handle these penguins. Because penguins have, you might notice, they're wearing these thick gloves. Everybody has these thick gloves on? Prepare yourself. So, penguins have very sharp beaks, razor sharp beaks on the edge, and there's a real penguin back there that at the end you can maybe take a look, and a sharp hook on the tip that fits into a slotted groove on the bottom. And when they bite you, they have extremely strong jaws, and they grab and they twist. So you get a cut, a welt, and a bruise all at once. It's lovely. So before long, our bodies were covered. Oh, yes. Our bodies were covered. I, to this day, have scars from penguins. And so when these volunteers are handing off the penguin back and forth, you're hearing all these screams as people are, you know, maybe the head got loose and they bit the person. So you'd always hear, "Aye, aye, aye," because in South Africa they say, "Aye." And actually there's a part in the book about this, but this is a new word that I learned was "aye." And so the louder the "aye," the worse the bite. So a lot of people, I mean all of us, we all ended up. And the thing is, you know, these gloves, it was hard to manage the penguins with them. So those of us that did have experience working with penguins just abandoned the gloves. You know, it just was too cumbersome. And so this is a person that was actually working out in the field, collecting them from their nests and putting them into boxes. And this was also a researcher who had a lot of experience, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be bitten. But you're just a little more used to it when you've worked with penguins. You're used to that pain. But after a while, you really stop noticing the pain. You do. You just become sort of numb to it. So now the day after we arrived, this new crisis emerged. All of a sudden, this oil spill, the ship had sunk near Robben Island. The oil spill now was moving, the slick was moving north towards Dasson Island, and there were 55,000 clean penguins on Dasson Island. And the researchers, the directors of this said, oh gosh, if it hits Dasson, we don't have the capacity to handle any more birds. We don't have the room to put them, we don't have the food to feed them, we don't have the volunteers to take care of them. You know, we just can't do it, so what are we going to do? And then Rob Crawford, who is a researcher down in Cape Town, he came up with this crazy idea. And he said, well, let's try maybe gathering the penguins that the oil slick is coming to the south part of the island, and there's a colony of about 20,000 penguins there. And they saw that literally like the next day the oil was going to hit this beach. Why don't we take those penguins before the oil hits, and we'll drive them 500 miles up the coast to Port Elizabeth and throw them into the water there and let them swim home, because we know it'll probably take them 2 to 3 weeks to swim back. And hopefully they'll find their way back, and hopefully by the time they get there, the oil spill will be cleaned up from the environment. So they kind of, loaded them up in these well-ventilated boxes and well-ventilated sheep shipping trucks. You have to be careful when you say sheep shipping trucks. I said it wrong before. And they moved them up the coast to Port Elizabeth, and they put satellite transmitters in the backs of 3 of these penguins, Peter, Pamela, and Percy, and watched, and the whole world watched, went to this website every day to see these penguins swimming home. And you might notice that Peter, in red there, is the first penguin to arrive on Robben Island, and he arrived on July 18th, which, some of you may know, is Nelson Mandela's birthday. And Robben Island is where he spent the first 17 years of his 27-year political imprisonment. And Peter didn't show up again for 4 years. Well, he didn't show up. They thought, well, what happened to Peter? His satellite transmitter tells us he got here, but we never have seen him. We haven't spotted him. Years went by, and they thought, gee, did he get eaten by a shark? Did he not, what happened? We don't know. And then 4 years after the oil spill, on April Fool's Day, he showed up. So I always like to say that Peter is a penguin with a flair for the dramatic. So, this is what happens when a penguin gets oiled. Obviously, oil and penguins don't mix. Oil and wildlife don't mix. So you asked about the cleaning process. So this is a penguin getting cleaned. And actually what they use, in South Africa at the time, they were using a product called LDC, light duty concentrate, which is basically a all-purpose household soap cleaner. Now, we know that Dawn is actually what's used by wildlife rehabbers. It's been found to be the most effective degreaser. In fact, 2 years before the treasure oil spill, we hosted a de-oiling wildlife workshop at the New England Aquarium. And this is what they said: Dawn is the best degreaser. So ever since that 1998, that's what's in my kitchen. But they didn't have access to Dawn at the time of this oil spill. I do believe they now donate to Sandcob. So when you clean an oiled penguin, this is a very laborious process. It would take 4 days to train a volunteer how to properly do this. It's a very meticulous process. And it would take 2 people at least an hour to clean 1 penguin. We had 20,000 penguins to clean. So this took a long time. And so what you essentially do is put them in a tub of hot soapy water, and you agitate that hot soapy water through their feathers until all that oil, because penguins have more feathers than any other bird on earth, 70 per square inch. So the size of a quarter, there's 70 feathers. So you got to get all that soapy water underneath there, and you would do this until the tub ran black and all the oil, it's filled with that oil. And then you go to the next tub and the next tub until finally that water ran clear. And so some penguins would need up to 10 or 15 tubs of hot soapy water before that water ran clear. But this is my favorite part of the whole treasure rescue. Before you wash the penguin, you spray them with a degreaser. And traditionally what they've used, and I didn't know this before, I learned this there, is a degreaser for breaking down that thick oil is a light oil. It will actually, a lighter oil will start to break down a heavier oil. And so they had traditionally used things like canola oil, sunflower oil, oils like that. And so what you do is you'd spray this oil onto the oiled penguin and let it marinate for like a half hour, and then you'd put it in the tubs of hot soapy water once that thick oil had loosened up a bit. Now, 2 years prior to the treasure oil spill, a 17-year-old kid, science student, had invented a degreaser. And they had been testing it at Sandcob and found it worked great. In fact, it worked better than the other oils they'd been using. And so they started using this degreaser during the treasure oil spill rescue, but partway through the rescue, they ran out. And so in a panic, Estelle, who was that center manager at Sandcob, she called, his name was Louis Koch. She called up Louis, she said, "Please, can you make more degreaser? We need more to save the penguins." So he and his father, who was a professor at a university nearby, went to the lab, and they worked day and night to make enough degreaser to wash the penguins. So I think it is the coolest thing in the world that a kid, a teenager, invented this product that saved the lives of tens of thousands of penguins. It's my favorite story from the rescue. Yeah?
How do you keep it out of their eyes?
How do you keep it out of their eyes? Each of the penguins, you put mineral oil, like a mineral, not mineral oil, mineral gel in the eyes before you would wash them. So, and also what they would do is actually use a toothbrush. So to get around the face and the eyes, they would use a toothbrush to get the soapy, area. So it was a very delicate process, which is part of why it took so long. So you did have to be careful of that. Right. Yep. So ultimately, the happy ending of this story is not only was it the largest animal rescue that's ever taken place, it was the most successful animal rescue that has ever taken place. So we had 20,000 oiled penguins, another 20,000 clean penguins that were moved to be rescued from this spill. So 40,000 penguins. Of those 40,000 penguins, 95% of them survived. Of the 20,000 oiled penguins, 91% of them survived, which actually is a better success rate than average. Like in much smaller spills, when there might be a few hundred penguins or just a couple thousand, they usually don't even have, they have maybe a 75 to 85% average success rate. So to have this be so successful, it's really nothing short of a miracle. And it's a tribute to those 12,500 extraordinary volunteers, because we absolutely could not have done it without them. And I do want to read you a brief passage about this as well.
So this is when they're being released?
This was them being released, and a lot of people, I know somebody's gonna ask me, so I'll tell you, what are those pink spots? Somebody says, is that a different species of penguin? No. These pink spots, when the penguins, prior to being released, they had to go through a process called grading, which is they had to go swim in a pool of cold water for an hour. And After that hour, they would be put on someone's lap, and you would run your fingers backwards across through all of their feathers to make sure there were no wet spots underneath, because underneath the stiff top of the feather is a downy portion, a downy base. And if there's any cold water, if there's any oil spots or any spots that aren't waterproof still, they have to hold that penguin until it's completely waterproof. Because if it does have dampness under there, it can't be released. It would get too cold out in the ocean. So once they had, and they were heavy enough, they gained enough weight, they weren't anemic, then they would have this little pink spot sprayed on their chest, so we know, okay, they're ready to go. And then also, this would aid the researchers out on the islands after they were released. They could quickly spot the penguins that had gone through this rescue effort. They say, oh, there's a treasure bird. And it's temporary. This goes away after some time. So, the day after we returned home, we had to leave before any penguins were released. So we didn't know what's going to happen to these birds. We still don't know if it's going to be successful or not. And it was so hard to leave when you knew you're leaving your colleagues behind and there's so much work still to be done. So we left on, here we go, the 18th. The day after we returned home, a jubilant email arrived from our South African colleagues informing us that the first group of rescued penguins had been released back into the wild. We had not been aware that on the very day we were flying out of Cape Town, this landmark moment was occurring in Milnerton, a suburb north of the city. On this same day, July 18th, the last of the oil was removed from the sunken ship, and the coasts of Robben and Dasson Island were cleared of oil contamination. This first release of rehabilitated penguins was a highly anticipated event, and it generated a great deal of attention from both the media and the general public. A large crowd of reporters, rescue workers, volunteers, and Cape Town residents gathered to watch as boxes containing 262 penguins were opened on the beach and clean penguins streamed out. As the birds raced towards a breaking surf, the rescue team celebrated this symbolic moment that marked a notable turning point in their mission. When it began, the rehabilitation of 19,000 oiled penguins seemed to be a nearly impossible task. Now, witnessing the first release of cleaned penguins, there was renewed hope that the remaining penguins would also survive their traumatic ordeal. It was a much-needed morale boost for the exhausted rescue workers, who were able to return to the rehabilitation center holding on to visions of clean, healthy penguins returning to their home in the sea. For us, back in the comfort of our homes in the United States, it was a very poignant moment. It had been almost unbearable to leave before seeing any of the birds return to the wild, as their fate was still unknown. And though I desperately wished we could have been there to witness the release of these clean, healthy penguins that we had helped to rehabilitate, the knowledge that this first group of birds had survived and made it back to the sea was deeply rewarding and provided evidence that our contributions to the effort had been both effective and worthwhile. So I think I have just a few more slides for you.
How long were they in rehab?
How long were they in rehab? The entire rescue was 3 months. Most of the birds had to be there for at least a month. So, they're rescued, and they're not all getting cleaned on the first day, obviously. So we would clean the most heavily oiled birds first, and, working our way to the more lightly oiled birds. And then some of these birds, were very thin when they arrived, so they'd have to be fattened up, they'd have to be fed, and they'd have to re-waterproof their feathers, which would take a week to 2. So most birds were there for at least a month to 6 weeks.
Will they be released in batches?
Yes, they were released in batches throughout that whole 3-month time. Exactly. And so then there were all these little poopers. The babies, remember I said at the beginning it was the breeding season, and so a lot of these babies had also been rescued, and so about 3,000 of them were hand-raised. And something they discovered during this rescue effort and the Apollo C before was that the survival rate for hand-raised penguin chicks is actually better than the survival rate of parent-raised penguin chicks. And so, armed with this knowledge now, SANPOB, that rehab center in South Africa, they rescue between usually 400 and 1,000 penguin chicks every year from the breeding islands, any chicks that are abandoned by their parents, and they hand-raise them. And they have an 80% success rate, which is an excellent success rate. So this is very important for the future survival of this species, which now is listed as endangered. And their population today is only about 25,000 pairs. Not because of this oil spill, but primarily because of overfishing and global warming. The climate change is moving their fish away from their area, their foraging areas. But we were able to save a lot of these little chicks, and this was again, the day after we arrived home. Apparently they did release some of the chicks that have been raised to this juvenile stage, which is sort of like a teenager stage. In fact, the penguin in the back table there is a juvenile Magellanic penguin, which is related to the African penguin, so it looks very similar. They're gray instead of black and white. And we got an email from our colleagues in South Africa saying, you know, we released the first batch of juveniles today, but because they had been raised by humans, when they turned over the boxes on the beach, the chicks didn't know what to do, and they all turned back around and, you know, looked towards the people. It's like, well, you got the food, you know, like, where do you want me to go? So I had to kind of shoo them towards the ocean, and eventually they saw their adult counterparts and went out to sea. I think I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so ultimately, as I said, this was an extremely successful rescue effort. And there were many different things that I personally learned, that we collectively learned.